It is a question that haunts the quiet corridors of history, a ghost lingering in the pages of what could have been. What if the Axis powers had won the Second World War? This alliance, a pact forged in ambition and ideology, was led by three primary nations: Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler, Fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini, and Imperial Japan under Emperor Hirohito. They sought to dismantle the existing world order and reshape it according to their own visions of power and racial purity. Their war was one of conquest, a brutal campaign that nearly succeeded. To imagine their victory is to step into a different reality, a world where the familiar signposts of our time have been torn down and replaced by something far more sinister and unsettling. For this dark timeline to unfold, history would need to pivot on a few critical moments. Perhaps the evacuation at Dunkirk fails, leading to the capture of the entire British expeditionary force and crippling the United Kingdom's ability to resist. Maybe the Battle of Britain is won by the Luftwaffe, paving the way for a successful German invasion across the English Channel. In the East, what if the Wehrmacht had captured Moscow before the brutal winter of 1941 set in, shattering the Soviet Union's will to fight? If these dominoes had fallen differently, the momentum could have become unstoppable, leaving the Axis powers as the undisputed masters of Europe and setting the stage for a global confrontation on their terms. With Europe secured, the Axis would have turned their full attention to the remaining threats. Imagine a scenario where German scientists develop the atomic bomb first, a terrifying weapon that they would not hesitate to use to force the surrender of the United States. A decisive naval victory against the U.S. Pacific Fleet, more complete than Pearl Harbor ever was, could have given Japan free rein across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. In this altered sequence of events, the war doesn't end in 1945 with Allied victory parades, but with capitulation. The world as we know it would cease to exist, replaced by a new, terrifying order dictated from Berlin and Tokyo. The feeling on the ground would be one of pervasive dread and suffocating control. The very air would seem different, heavy with the weight of the new reality. People would learn to speak in whispers, to glance over their shoulders before sharing a thought. Trust would become a rare and precious commodity, as neighbors could become informants and friends could disappear in the night. The grand ideals of liberty, equality, and democracy would be dismissed as failed experiments of a decadent past. In their place would rise new pillars of society: obedience, conformity, and unwavering loyalty to the state. This is not just a change of flags and leaders, it is a fundamental rewiring of human existence. In a Europe under the shadow of the swastika, life would be a grim tableau of oppression and rigid control. The continent would be reorganized into the Greater Germanic Reich, a vast empire ruled directly from Berlin. The grand cities like Paris, Vienna, and Prague would become provincial capitals, their cultures systematically suppressed and Germanized. Monuments would be torn down, languages forbidden in public life, and history books rewritten to glorify the conquerors. Daily existence would be governed by a labyrinth of rules designed to enforce conformity. Curfews, identity papers, and constant surveillance would be the norm, turning every street corner into a potential checkpoint and every citizen into a potential suspect. Freedom would become a distant, almost mythical memory. The press, radio, and arts would be nothing more than propaganda arms of the state, churning out a constant stream of messages reinforcing the Nazi ideology. Any form of dissent, no matter how small, would be ruthlessly crushed by the Gestapo and its network of spies. Political opposition would be unthinkable, as all parties would be outlawed except for the Nazi Party. Religious freedoms would be curtailed, with faiths deemed incompatible with Nazi beliefs being persecuted or eradicated. People would live in a state of perpetual anxiety, their lives dictated by the whims of a totalitarian regime that valued racial purity and blind obedience above all else. The social fabric of Europe would be violently rewoven based on the twisted racial theories of the Third Reich. Those deemed Aryan would be granted a privileged status, while Slavic peoples and other groups labeled Untermenschen, subhumans, would be subjected to forced labor, relocation, and enslavement to serve their German masters. The Holocaust would not be a historical atrocity that ended in 1945. It would be a completed project, its horrific logic extended across the conquered territories. Society would be stratified into a rigid caste system, where one's worth and destiny were determined solely by the arbitrary judgment of bloodline, creating a permanent state of fear and division. For the average person, daily life would be a struggle for survival within this oppressive system. The economy would be entirely geared towards serving the needs of the Reich, with resources from conquered lands plundered to enrich Germany. Food and goods would be rationed, with the best reserved for Germans and party officials. Citizens would be encouraged to inform on one another, breaking the bonds of community and family in the name of loyalty to the state. Children would be indoctrinated from birth in institutions like the Hitler Youth, taught to revere the Führer and to see the world through the hateful lens of Nazi ideology, ensuring the Reich's dark vision would endure for generations. Across the world in Asia, a different but equally oppressive empire would hold sway. Imperial Japan, having achieved its goal of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, would rule a vast territory stretching from Manchuria to the East Indies, and perhaps even into Australia and India. The promise of Asia for the Asiatics would be exposed as a hollow lie, a mere justification for brutal Japanese domination. Tokyo, not the local capitals, would be the center of all power. Local languages and customs would be suppressed in favor of Japanese culture, which would be enforced as the superior standard for all peoples within the sphere. Life under Japanese military rule would be harsh and unforgiving. The Kempeitai, the dreaded military police, would operate with impunity, their authority absolute and their methods brutal. Any sign of resistance or disrespect toward the Japanese authorities would be met with severe punishment, including public executions, torture, and the imprisonment of entire families. The emperor would be worshipped as a living god, and this state-mandated religion would be forced upon all conquered peoples. Daily life would be a constant performance of submission, a careful dance to avoid attracting the wrong kind of attention from the ever-present soldiers and officials who held the power of life and death. The economies of the conquered nations would be ruthlessly exploited to fuel Japan's imperial machine. Natural resources like oil, rubber, and tin would be stripped from the land and shipped to Japan, leaving local populations impoverished. Food production would be redirected to feed the Japanese army and home islands, leading to widespread famine and malnutrition across Southeast Asia. The people of Korea, China, the Philippines, and other nations would be treated as second-class citizens in their own lands, their labor forced and their property subject to seizure at any moment. The co-prosperity sphere would be a sphere of suffering, built on the backs of millions. The psychological impact of this new order would be profound. Generations would grow up knowing nothing but subjugation, their own histories and identities erased and replaced by a Japanese narrative of conquest and destiny. They would be taught to feel shame for their own heritage and to aspire to a Japanese ideal they could never truly achieve. The spirit of independence and self-determination would be driven deep underground, surviving only in secret whispers and dangerous acts of rebellion. The sun on the Japanese flag would seem to cast a permanent shadow, a constant reminder of a lost world and a future dictated by a foreign master. In this fractured world, the United States would exist as a diminished and isolated power. Having been forced into a humiliating peace treaty, perhaps after the atomic bombing of a major city or a series of crushing naval defeats, America would be a nation transformed by failure. Its global influence would be gone, its military restricted, and its economy struggling under the weight of war reparations paid to the victors. The American spirit, once defined by optimism and boundless possibility, would be replaced by a culture of resentment, fear, and introspection. Political extremism, both from the far left and far right, would likely flourish in this climate of national despair. The rest of the world would be carved up into spheres of influence, a global chessboard for the German and Japanese empires. Africa would become a vast German colony, its people and resources exploited on an industrial scale. The remnants of the British Empire, such as Canada and Australia, would find themselves isolated and vulnerable, caught between the two dominant Axis powers. South America might fall under the sway of fascist sympathizing regimes, becoming economic vassals to the new global order. There would be no United Nations, no international law, and no concept of universal human rights. The world would be governed by the simple, brutal principle that might makes right. History itself would become the ultimate casualty. The past would be rewritten to fit the narratives of the victors. In this new world, Hitler and Hirohito would be remembered not as tyrants, but as visionary leaders who brought order to a chaotic world. The Holocaust and the rape of Nanking would be denied, erased from official records, or justified as necessary actions to purify society. Children in schools across the globe would learn a version of history where the Axis powers were the heroes and the Allies were the decadent aggressors who stood in the way of progress. The truth would survive only in forbidden books and the fading memories of those who lived through the war. To contemplate this alternate reality is a vital, if chilling, exercise. It forces us to recognize how fragile our own world is and how different things could have been. The freedoms we often take for granted, freedom of speech, of belief, of assembly, were not guaranteed. They were secured at an immense cost by a generation that stood against tyranny. Thinking about a world where they failed is not just a flight of fancy. It is a stark reminder of what was at stake. It underscores the importance of vigilance, the courage to stand up to intolerance, and the enduring value of the principles the Axis sought to destroy. The world we have is not perfect, but it was worth fighting for.